Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Daniel Estulin. Welcome to Daniel Estulin.media. Today we have a wonderful guest, a very special guest, chairwoman of Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, I'm glad to be with you.
You said it yourself the other day that rising tensions between Russia, the United States, and China, and also obviously the United States and China themselves, all thermonuclear powers can provoke the unthinkable. Now, most people think that is far too fetched, but even Lavrov said the other day that a thermonuclear war is a distinct possibility the way things stand. What is your take on the situation right now?
I think it's extremely dangerous because, I think there is a complete misjudgment about, how the Russians perceive the situation. People in the West say, why is Russia reacting this way? NATO is not a threat. But the reality is, if you look at the prehistory, nowadays you can't even say that there is a prehistory because the demonization of Putin is so absolute. And, in Germany, for example, or in the United States, there is a complete anti-Russian hysteria. If you look at the TV right now, it is absolutely unbelievable that they only have people on who say more weapons, more heavy weapons. Today in Ramstein, which is the US base in Rhineland-Pfalz, Rhineland-Palatia, 40 nations are being hosted by Secretary of Defense Austin. I don't think he asked for permission. Where is sovereignty when you need it? But the hysteria is more weapons, more heavy weapons, to basically face Russia down, crush Russia. The French finance minister, Le Maire, had said it a couple of weeks ago. The aim of all of this is to crush Russia, to crush Putin. And, I think this is very, very dangerous because I think there are red lines. And, these red lines are, this is uncharted waters. Nobody knows exactly where. But, I think we are very, very dangerously close to a nuclear war by accident. Anything can happen. Fake false flag operations are being warned against. And, I think, I insist that you have to look at the prehistory, which really started in 1990. It's all documented. It's proof that Baker, James Baker III, the Secretary of State at that time, did give promises. Genscher has said it. There are tapes which absolutely confirm that Russia was given promises NATO would not expand. And, if you look at the situation now, NATO is 1,000 kilometers to the east, not 1 inch, but 1,000 kilometers. And Russia felt, really encroached. And there are now reports coming out, like from Swiss intelligence, that, the prehistory before the attack occurred, Zelensky had made a law, or there was a law in the Ukrainian parliament that Ukraine would take Crimea back militarily. Then, there was this demand by Zelensky that Ukraine should have nuclear weapons again. So there is a long, long history. And the war did not start on February 24th, but it started on the 16th when, there was a 30-time increase in the artillery bombardment of the Donbass. So in a certain sense, if people are not willing to discuss the prehistory, you cannot discuss how to get out of it. And right now, if you listen to Biden, to Boris Johnson, to Stoltenberg, none of them talks about diplomacy anymore. All say this has to be settled militarily. And there are some former generals like Dr. Erich Warth in Germany who says this thinking to settle this militarily will lead to a catastrophe. You have to end it diplomatically. But they are not talking about that. So I think we are sitting on a complete powder keg.
There's a clear indication, obviously, the United States and NATO alliance in general, they have no intentions to negotiate at all. As you said, they're arming Ukraine to the teeth to use them as cannon fodder to try to bleed Russia over the next few months, over the next few years. Why so much hatred towards Russia, especially right now?
Well, I think they were quite happy with Yeltsin. Yeltsin was playing the game of the Washington Consensus, the unipolar world. But then when Putin came in, he started to, take Russia back for, a Russian sovereign standpoint. And, when Obama called Russia to be a regional player, Putin did not go along with it. And he started to, say Russia is one of the major players in the world. So they really hated that because the whole idea was to create an unipolar world and eliminate every government through regime change, through color revolution. So especially, with the rise of China, I mean, I watched all of these security papers published by the Pentagon, and from end of 2017 on, which was about the time when the Belt and Road Initiative became really very visible and a big factor in the situation, they started to say Russia and China is the enemy, it's an opponent, it's not only a competitor. And ever since, naturally the rise of China and naturally now the alliance or the partnership, not alliance, but partnership between Russia and China is regarded to be the absolute enemy. And I think the Chinese have understood that, which is why they don't, they don't distance themselves from Russia, because they know that if they don't hang together, they would be the next target of a similar treatment with Taiwan.
You mentioned several times recently the whole concept of the moral collapse of the transatlantic world. I read an article recently from the Executive Intelligence Review where you guys are talking about the moral collapse of the transatlantic world cries out for a new paradigm. So what is this new paradigm? And how do we go about building it?
Well, the new paradigm is how should mankind live together in 100 years from now? Do you still think that we should have geopolitical confrontation and wars? We as a human species will only make it if we understand that there has to be an idea of the one humanity first. And I think that we have to, in the evolution, in the history of mankind, we have reached a point where either we act as if we are that one humanity or we will destroy each other. So I think the first thing about the new paradigm is to think that there should never again be a national interest which is in contradiction to the interest of humanity as a whole. National interest is legitimate, but it must be in cohesion with the one humanity. And I think that is the conceptual jump. And it's quite easy because, we have also said the new name for peace is development. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has said many, many times that there can be no peace order if you do not uplift dramatically the living standard of the developing countries. And I think that's the other thing, poverty eradication. Why should 2 billion people of the planet not have access to clean water? We have right now, because of the sanctions against Russia, on top of the previous already collapsing financial system, the United Nations has said that 1.7 billion people are in acute danger of starvation. So that has to be overcome. And if the governments of this world would have sense, they would get together and say, we will now double the food production. We will make sure that not one human being is starving to death. And the only countries which are doing that are Russia and India and China. Xi Jinping has declared food security to be one of his priorities for the whole world. Russia and China and India have just made an agreement whereby Russia is exporting more fertilizer to India, and India has the capacity to increase the production of wheat dramatically. So these countries are attending it. But what is the European Union doing? And the United States, they say we have to stick to the rules-based order. And part of these rules are the WTO, and that says you have to set aside land for environmental reasons. So you cannot even produce more food when 1.7 billion people are about to die. That is the problem with the West.
As you said, there's 1.7 billion people around the world who are going hungry and starving. And this is, of course, only the beginning. There are roughly, 2 billion people across the world that spend more than 50% of their income on food. In a sense, it's a kind of a genuine paradox. Our planet has everything we need to produce nutritious, natural food to feed the entire world population many times over. In the cases, despite the ravages of industrialized agriculture over the past half a century or more, then the question is, how can it be that our world faces, according to some predictions, the prospect of a decade or more of famine on a global scale?
Well, that's only if you project the present trend into the future, but I think this will not happen. I think we are in for absolutely dramatic changes, as you say. You know, we have right now a hyperinflationary tendency which is expressed in the food and the energy price. And, you know, it's already now that the poorer parts of the population in every country, even in the United States or in Germany, they can't manage anymore. And if you project this a little bit more in the future, you will have social unrest. Look at Lebanon. There are long chains in front of the bakeries. Look at Egypt. There are many countries which are already now on the verge of a social catastrophe. And, you know, that all requires a complete change in the paradigm. And if the West is not morally fit to go along, short of nuclear war, you know, I think that there will be a new world economic order around the Belt and Road Initiative. There are many countries like the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation countries, the Eurasian Economic Union. They are now getting together and say, we have to go for an alternative system because there is no other way. The West is trying to exclude Russia, and I don't think this will function. You saw that many countries of the developing countries are not agreeing to isolate Russia. So we are heading for potentially a complete decoupling of the transatlantic world from the rest of the world. And you know, that obviously implies incredible dangers. And this is why the Schiller Institute is trying to, you know, find people in the United States and in Europe who say, no, we have to have a different approach. We have to have a cooperation and replace confrontation with cooperation.
Food policy is obviously a global supranational concern. And back in 1971, if I'm not mistaken, your husband, Zepp-LaRouche, said that if the International Monetary Fund would continue their policy of monetarist austerity, you would see practically pandemic eruption. That's what we're seeing right now. You would see mass genocide, what we're seeing right now. And the condition of the developing countries, for the most part, is the result of first a colonial policy and also continuation of that policy by the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, et cetera, and also the leading, obviously, financial institutions of the world. It's kind of a cold-blooded policy to keep the markets happy, and the governments have long become the servants of these financial institutions. But the question everyone is asking is, who's pushing these depopulation agenda?
Well, it's on the one side, very concretely, the cartels. Look at the food cartels. I mean, there are about 5 or 6 major food cartels who control everything from the seeds. You know, they control who gets the seeds, who get what seeds, to the planting, to the harvest, to the food processing. So that's a big factor. Then naturally the big banks, the insurance companies. It's what you could call the financial oligarchy of the City of London and Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And, you know, these people have undergone their own paradigm shift somewhere between the 60s and the 70s. They shifted completely to a system of profit making. And this is what my late husband, absolutely like a prophet, really recognized. He said in 71, when this shift occurred, when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold and lifted the fixed exchange rates to replace them with floating exchange rates, he said that effort, if you would continue on that road, would lead to the danger of a new fascism and the danger of a new world war. And that's exactly 50 years later where we are today. And, you know, these forces, they are determined to keep their bubble going, but I don't think it will function. I think this is coming to an end. You know, the hyperinflation which you see right now, people say this will only be temporary. This is ridiculous. You have such a totally overblown, indebted system that they cannot even raise the interest rate, which some would like to do because of the inflation, because even the tiniest increase in the interest rate implies the danger of a complete blowout of the system, including of the emerging countries, and it has reached. So what we are looking at is a potential hyperinflationary blowout, like it happened in Germany in 1923, except this time it's not in one country, but it's in the whole transatlantic sector. And only those countries who have a sort of protection, not total convertibility of their currency and capital controls, these are protected. And this is why, there is right now such a very intensive discussion among some of these blocs, which I mentioned before, the BRICS, the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, how to protect your currency and your economy against such a blowout.
One of the things that came across on your pages, the Schiller Institute and Executive Intelligence Review, is the concept of coincidence of opposites. You promoted as an effort to put together this anti-Malthusian movement. Can you explain a little bit what that is, please?
Yes. It's actually a philosophical conception which comes from one of the greatest philosophical minds of universal history. His name is Nicolaus of Cusa. He lived in the 15th century. He's the father of the modern sovereign nation state. He's the father of modern science. And he developed this conception that the human mind is capable of thinking the one which is of a higher power than the many. This is a very profound philosophical conception which naturally came out of his theological reflections, but it is applicable to everything, because the human mind is creative and you can always think the one which is higher than the level on which the conflicts arise. Now, that is a conception which was, in my view, developed in the Peace of Westphalia, where after 150 years of religious war, the warring parties came to the conclusion that a continuation of the war would leave nobody left alive. So they decided to sit together and agree on principles, which was the beginning of international law. The first principle was, for the interest of peace, you have to, from now on, take care of the interest of the other. And also, for the sake of peace, you have to put foreign policy on the basis of love. So these were very important conceptions, and they came from this idea that you have to think about the one humanity first. And you can also apply the same concept today, because if you are not capable of recognizing that there is a higher interest uniting all nations on this planet, then you are falling into the trap of geopolitics. So it's a very fruitful philosophical conception, which I can only, suggest that people study.
Let's talk a little about your upcoming Schiller Institute conference. Now, you had one on April 9th, if I'm not mistaken, on a new international security and development architecture. We had many important speakers, amongst them Antonov, a Russian representative for the United Nations, if I'm not mistaken, was one of them. So what will be discussed in the upcoming May 7th Schiller Institute conference?
Well, essentially, it will be a continuation of the last one, because what we have initiated is this idea that you have to have an international security architecture which includes the interest of every single nation, which is why we had, in the last conference, we had speakers from Russia, the United States, Europe, India, South Africa, Latin America. And it's the idea that if we as a humanity cannot come together and decide on principles which guarantee the survival of all of us, then we are no better than some wild animals, even so wild animals are not as mean as some people sometimes behave. So this was a very productive conference, and we have this idea that you have to put the international security architecture on the basis of common development. So it's an international security and development architecture because, once you have an agreement for the development of all nations, Africa, Latin America, Asia, the poorer parts of Europe and the United States, then that common interest can be the basis for a common security architecture. So what the next conference is addressing mainly is young people. Because, if you put yourselves in the shoes of a young person, let's say in Germany or, France, Italy, the United States, it's not like looking like a bright future. I mean, you're looking at World War III, you're looking at a collapsing economy, a collapsing financial system, world starvation, a pandemic which is not yet under control. So, this is a conference which is supposed to, form a partnership of young people from all over the world to fight for a better future, because the future, belongs to the young people. And they are not being asked right now, is it really their interest that the world should go up in a thermonuclear mushroom followed by a nuclear winter? So, also young people should have a say what is their future. There are so exciting developments taking place. For example, we are on the verge of getting thermonuclear fusion energy. I mean, that is incredible, because once we have commercial thermonuclear fusion, we have energy security and raw material security on the planet. Then, also space travel will be much enhanced because you have a different fuel for space travel. The whole idea of cooperation in space, moon villages, eventually build a city on Mars. All of these are things which excite young people, because that is where humanity can go, provided we get out of this present crisis. So that is what this conference will address, and I think we will have many young people from all 5 continents.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, the youth conference is on May the 7th and the Schiller conference on May the 8th, or are they both on the same day?
No, this time it's only the May 7th for the youth, and soon we will have another Schiller conference along the same lines, also discussing these issues, but it will be only May the 7th.
Now, I remember back in 2003, Lyndon LaRouche, he explained that only the creation of a youth movement based upon an understanding of fundamental principles, such as the distinction that makes man different from the beast, and that is committed to fight for policies based on those principles, will have the staying power to prevent a slide back into the crisis and chaos. My question is, how do we help our youth to find within themselves this divine spark of reason?
Well, I think, my own experience is that if a young person meets at least one person, it can be a teacher, a parent, a professor, some other relevant person, who somehow gets the spark of creativity in that person going, then there is a chance. The problem is that many people, they become adults and they get old and they die, and they never had the experience of what it really means to be creative, to write a poem, a good poem, or to write, make some discovery in fundamental physics or biology, or discover something else. And I think that is really what is the fight about, because it is my firmest belief that if every child would have the chance to be exposed to a universal education which gets that spark going, this would be the end of the oligarchy, because the only reason why the oligarchy can rule is because they have developed means to keep people stupid. Right now, for example, I'm very concerned about the fact that so many young people believe that they have to participate in TikTok little movies about themselves, singing or dancing some ridiculous thing. And there are apparently almost 2 billion young people who are doing that, and they think to be an influencer is the greatest thing in town. I don't think that Kepler discovered gravitation in 8 seconds. And the psychological studies right now, which say that the average concentration span of young people is 8 seconds. And that naturally has to do a lot with gaming, a lot to do with, being addicted to your smartphone. And, I think that the real challenge is that people recognize that this all can become an addiction. For example, the fact that you have a verb which says to Google, rather than studying and discovering truth by reading books and really going into the depths of a subject, people say, oh, I have to Google that. And then they print out some ridiculous, sheet, and they think that that is a discovery. I think we have to have a polemic. I think it's important that young people from all different countries start an ideology project. This is what my late husband, encouraged young people in many countries to do, because you have to become aware of your own ideology. It's not self-evident, it's not self-evident how you think. You have to study the axioms of your thinking, because why is it that different people react to the same event so differently and interpret it so differently? It has to do with the axioms. And people have to develop a self-conscience. And, when you have that and improve it and study and become, a universally educated person, you are free. And this internal freedom, that is what counts.
In your October 23rd, 2021 conference entitled The Coming Fall of the Cult of God, you juxtapose two irreconcilable views of men. Now, on the one side, you have the almost dominant, at least in certain countries, view that man is a parasite. The man burdens nature, that he has a CO2 footprint, which makes him trouble for Mother Earth, and therefore he endangers the planet. That's one side, one view of man. What is the other view of man?
Well, the other view of man is that the human mind is in complete cohesion, or the laws of the human mind are in complete cohesion with the laws of the physical universe. Now, that can be proven because, again and again, humanity was able to produce ideas. And, you cannot weigh an idea, you cannot measure it. It's an immaterial thing produced by creative reason. But if this idea is adequate, it discovers a universal physical principle. And if you apply that, you call that scientific and technological progress. And if you apply that technological progress in the production process, it leads to an increase of productivity, of the labor, of the productive forces. And then you increase the living standard, the longevity, the number of people who can be maintained. My husband called this the relative potential population density. And the fact that an immaterial idea can change the material condition for now almost 8 billion people is the proof that there must be a cohesion between what the mind thinks and the physical laws of the universe. And I think this is a very exciting idea because that is really what differentiates us from all other living beings, at least those we know about. It can be that we discover some other species, now with the James Webb telescope, we probably can discover things we don't even know the question for yet, including, what was before the Big Bang. I believe that the universe existed before the Big Bang, and soon we will know about it because the James Webb telescope will show us the pictures going back to the supposed origin of the universe. And then the question is, what was there before? In any case, these are all extremely exciting questions. But this image of man, what I think is the real one, or what the true nature of man is, that man is limitless perfectible. His intellect is limitless perfectible, and even the beauty of his character is limitless, perfectible. Most people are so concerned about their body. They go to the fitness club. I have seen men who make these exercises. Say you have to do it like this so that your muscle develops here and not there, and it's ridiculous. It's okay, they can do whatever they want, but if they would pay the same attention to developing their mind, we would be much better off
as the species. Why is it so few people? I mean, there's so much stuff going on right now in the world, but why is it that so few people are aware of the acute danger in which we, the people, civilization finds itself in?
Well, it's because, most people are intimidated by the oligarchy. The oligarchy, think about the Roman Empire when they had the circus and the amphitheater, the gladiators, the lions would eat the Christians, all of this games and entertainment to distract people, to keep people under control. Today it's the entertainment industry which has the same function. So most people are so, they think so little of themselves that they turn on the TV or internet or games. They only want to go to vacation. They don't spend the time to think and to discover. And that is why people are very intimidated and fearful and try to not think about the reality, because once you start to think about it, you get into trouble. And I think that is really the mechanism of control. So the more people start to think and understand that it's actually very easy, because once you really develop the joy of discovery, my favorite philosopher, Nicholas of Cusa, he also talked about the sweetness of truth. And he said that once people start to taste the sweetness of truth, then they will find that this is much sweeter than any meal they can eat, any food they can enjoy, because it is the pleasure of creative thinking, which is what is human.
We have enough time for a couple more questions. I want to turn my attention to Middle East and Africa. We're seeing the humanitarian emergency in Syria and also in Yemen. How do these two cases, for example, fit into this global systemic collapse we're witnessing around us?
Well, I think the situation in Syria, was one of the countries which, was supposed to be undergoing regime change against, the Assad government. And, it failed basically because Putin decided to intervene militarily in 2015. But, as it's still going on, the Western countries have been working with the so-called rebels. Now, who are these rebels? This was ISIS, this Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, took different names and shades. But, it was really an effort to have regime change against all countries which do not fit the unipolar world. And Yemen, unfortunately, which is, it's a very tragic situation because it's a proxy war, which also was played, to contain the or to play the so-called conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Even so, the Houthis basically deny that they have such influences from Iran. But it's two cases, where you have the greatest humanitarian crisis going on. The Catholic Cardinal Senari had already 2 years ago called for the United States to abandon the Caesar sanctions, because more than 90% of the Syrian population are on a starvation level. Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, was in Yemen, and he made an incredible video called Hunger Ward, which I can only emphasize everybody must watch, which shows how babies and children are dying in the hospital. They have little arms, like the size of a finger of other people, and he could not do anything about them, seeing them die in front of his own eyes. And he appealed, to the world to do something about it, but I don't think much has happened. And look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. And, when the NATO left, and the US and all the NATO countries, they left, and they knew that 80% of the Afghanistan budget was coming from so-called donor money, and they cut it off. So they threw consciously the entire Afghanistan economy into the nothing. Now, 25 million people in Afghanistan are food insecure. I don't know how many died in the meantime in this winter. I mean, when somebody talks about rules-based order and democracy and human rights, and I think about what happens in Afghanistan, these words have become so shallow. And, it is absolutely upsetting, because the Afghanistan people, they have had 40 years of war, and what is being done to them is just not fair.
If we compare Europe, which is in a state of decomposition, and we compare Africa, now people think of Africa as something which is like third, fourth world, but we're seeing economic infrastructure development, for example, in countries like Ethiopia, railroads, agriculture gains, the grand renaissance down, renewable energies. So what's Africa's future? Because I know that Schiller Institute Executive Intelligence Review, your husband, LaRouche, you've done a lot of work on working with African nations, on working on this African dialogue and developing the future of the continent.
Well, the first time we wrote an Africa development program was in 1976. We published it in 78. Which was the idea that you need infrastructure, a comprehensive infrastructure program, waterways, ports, integrated with highways, railways. And, in a certain sense, this started to happen when China started to build railroads, and now with the Belt and Road Initiative, for the first time, there is the possibility that these plans are being implemented. And you can look at Africa either, that it's a source of trouble, poverty, disease, refugees, or you can take a look at it in a different way. You can say by 2050, 2.5 billion people will be living in Africa. That means you need a lot of productive jobs. And then Africa will have the youngest average population on the planet. So if you put in the right kind of development right now, and there are many young leaders who really want to develop Africa, and who are thinking completely different than the former colonial powers, then Africa can become the new China, but with African characteristics. I think that Africa can become the powerhouse of the future. And, therefore, I think the conflict which we see right now playing out is not between the so-called democracies and the so-called autocratic regimes, as it's always being said. But what we see right now is the conflict between the former colonial powers and the so-called victims, the former colonies, who have understood that they have to take the development in their own hands. And mainly because of China and the Belt and Road Initiative, there is right now the real possibility to overcome underdevelopment and poverty for the first time. So, I think that is really the crucial. We are right now at a complete change of the system. The old system is gone. The old order is hopelessly gone. There is no way how you can go back to an unipolar world. But I think even a multipolar world is not good, because multipolarity still has the idea of a geopolitical confrontation. And that is why I think this idea of the new paradigm, the one humanity, or Xi Jinping calls it the shared community, of the joint destiny of mankind. That is the idea of the future. And I think that that will be an idea which will catch on. And that's what our youth conference on May 7th will discuss, because, you know, it is not a foregone conclusion, but you need people to fight for it. You know, and there's no better thing than young people who have a lot of energy and a lot of passion take on this fight.
Helga, before we go, so May 7th is the Schiller Institute Youth Conference. How can people sign up to watch it?
Well, if you are so kind, you put the link where people can register under your video. Then you can go to the website of the Schiller Institute. We will put a link there. You can register for it. So I think that the best way is to become a member of the Schiller Institute, because you see, this is a movement for a new renaissance. And, you know, we need a lot of activists, because, you know, it's, as I said, you know, the future is really not decided. And I think you have periods, you know, where for a long time things are stable and one cannot do a lot because, you know, the powers to be have everything arranged. But then comes what I call the star hours of history, you know, like 1989, when the wall came down in Germany. That was such a star hour, and it was lost, you know, because there was a geopolitical manipulation which ruined it. We have written a book about it, and we have made movies about it. So if you are interested, you can access those. But now we are in one of those moments, you know, where everything is completely open, and the chance to create a totally different future is there. So that's why you should join us and become a member.
Helga, thank you so much for joining us. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, chairwoman of Schiller Institute from Germany. Thanks so much again for being with us.
Well, thank you for your time and having me.
Take care.